The morning my son told me he couldn't afford my insulin, he drove away in a brand new pickup truck. At first, I didn't think much about it. People buy new vehicles every day. What I couldn't understand was how someone who claimed $20 for his father's medicine was too much somehow had no trouble making a monthly payment on a truck that cost more than my first house. My name is Raymond Ellis. I'm 70 years old, a retired school janitor from Tulsa, Oklahoma. For 42 years, I unlocked classroom doors before sunrise, shoveled snow from the sidewalks in winter, and stayed late every evening so children would walk into clean classrooms the next morning. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work. My wife Linda used to tell me, nobody notices a clean school until it isn't clean. She had a way of making even ordinary jobs feel important. She passed away 5 years ago after a long battle with breast cancer. Since then, diabetes has become my own daily battle. Every morning begins the same way. Check my blood sugar, prepare breakfast, take my insulin. Without it, my body reminds me very quickly that age doesn't negotiate. My pension covered most of my expenses, but rising medical costs slowly swallowed my savings. When Linda died, I promised myself I'd never become a burden to anyone, especially not to my only son. Matthew had always been ambitious. As a child, he'd tell everyone he wanted to live in the nicest house on the nicest street. I admired his determination. I just hoped he wouldn't mistake success for happiness. He married Emily 7 years ago. Emily was warm, thoughtful, and somehow managed to make every family gathering feel comfortable. She never forgot birthdays. She always brought homemade desserts when she visited. If she noticed my refrigerator getting emptier each month, she never embarrassed me by mentioning it. Instead, groceries would mysteriously appear on my porch the next morning. Whenever I thanked her, she'd smile. Oh, we bought too much. I knew better. She was protecting my pride. Matthew, on the other hand, had changed. Not overnight, slowly. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became less frequent. Conversations somehow always returned to money. Dad, you really should think about selling your house. Dad, that neighborhood is getting older. Dad, maintaining a place that size doesn't make financial sense. I always gave him the same answer. This house isn't just wood and bricks. It was where Linda taught Matthew to ride his first bicycle, where we celebrated every Christmas, where my wife planted the maple tree in the front yard 30 years earlier. Some places become part of your family. You don't sell them because someone thinks the market is favorable. Then came the Tuesday everything changed. I picked up my insulin prescription from the pharmacy. The pharmacist looked at her computer before giving me an apologetic smile. Mr. Ellis, your supplemental coverage changed this month. My stomach tightened. How much? She hesitated. $20? To many people, $20 isn't much. To someone living from one pension payment to the next, it can feel enormous. I'll come back tomorrow, I said quietly. She looked at me with kind eyes. I'm sorry. I nodded and walked out carrying nothing. The entire drive home, I kept calculating my budget. Electric bill, groceries, property tax, medicine. Something had to give. That evening, I called Matthew. He answered after the fourth ring. Hey, Dad. I hate asking, I began, but I'm a little short this month. How much? $20? Silence, then a sigh. Dad, things are really tight right now. I understand. We've got mortgage payments, insurance, repairs. You know how life is. I wasn't asking for much. I know. Another pause. I'm sorry, Dad, we just can't afford it. I forced a smile even though he couldn't see it. That's all right. We'll figure something out next month. Of course. After hanging up, I sat alone in my kitchen for nearly an hour. The next morning, I opened my insulin pen. Instead of taking my full dose, I carefully dialed half. Then I whispered the words I prayed Linda would never have to hear. I just need this to last a little longer. 3 days later, I accidentally discovered what my son meant when he said they couldn't afford $20. And it broke my heart in a way diabetes never could. I found out about the house through a photograph. It appeared on my phone while I was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to convince myself that half a dose of insulin was enough. Emily had posted it online. She stood in front of a small white house with blue shutters, holding a silver key in one hand. Matthew stood beside her with his arm around her waist. A red ribbon stretched across the front porch, The caption read, "A new beginning for our family." At first I smiled. I thought perhaps they had finally moved into the home Matthew always talked about buying. Then I saw the second photograph. Matthew was standing beside a property agent, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Sold, $60,000. My hands went cold. 3 days earlier, my son had told me he couldn't afford $20. Now he was smiling beside a house worth $60,000. I stared at the picture until the words blurred. It wasn't the money that hurt most. It was how easily he had lied. He had not said, "Dad, I don't want to help." He had said, "We can't afford it." There is a difference. One is rejection. The other is deception. I set the phone down and opened the refrigerator. Inside were 3 eggs, half a carton of milk and a jar of mustard. For several minutes I stood there listening to the refrigerator hum. Then I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because sometimes pain becomes too heavy to carry quietly. That night I took another half dose. The following morning, my hands began trembling. I told myself it was hunger. By noon I felt dizzy. By evening, I couldn't walk from the living room to the kitchen without holding the wall. I should have called someone. But the only person whose number I knew by heart was the same person who had told me $20 was beyond his reach. So I sat in Linda's old chair and waited for the room to stop spinning. It didn't. The next thing I remember was hearing someone pound on my front door. "Mr. Ellis!" It was my neighbor, Mrs. Dalton. She had noticed my curtains were still closed at 3 in the afternoon. When I didn't answer, she used the spare key I had given her years ago. She found me on the floor beside the sofa. The paramedic said my blood sugar had risen dangerously high. At the hospital, a young doctor asked whether I had been taking my insulin correctly. I looked away. "Mr. Ellis," he said gently, "I need the truth. I've been making it last." His expression changed. "How long?" "4 days." He sat beside the bed. "Insulin is not something you can safely ration without medical supervision." "I understand." "Do you?" His voice wasn't cruel. That somehow made it worse. "You could have gone into a coma." I nodded. He asked whether I had family. I gave him Matthew's number. The nurse called 3 times. He never answered. When I was discharged the next afternoon, Mrs. Dalton drove me home and placed a paper bag of groceries on my counter. "I don't need charity," I told her. She folded her arms. "Good, because this isn't charity, it's neighborly interference." That sounded exactly like something Linda would have said. After Mrs. Dalton left, I found a small pharmacy bag beneath the groceries. Inside was a fresh box of insulin pens. There was no receipt, only a note. "You don't have to pay me back." I sat at the table holding that note for a long time. Then someone knocked, not softly, desperately. 3 quick knocks, a pause, then 3 more. When I opened the door, Emily was standing on my porch. Her hair was uncombed. Her eyes were red. She wore an old grey sweatshirt instead of the elegant clothes she usually wore around Matthew. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she looked past me and saw the hospital bracelet still around my wrist. Her face lost all color. "What happened?" "Nothing serious. Please don't lie to me." The words were sharper than I expected. I stepped aside and let her in. She placed her handbag on the kitchen table and noticed the pharmacy bag. "Did you get your insulin?" "Yes." "How?" "A neighbor helped." Emily closed her eyes. When she opened them again, tears had gathered along her lower lashes. "I sent Matthew money for your prescription." I stared at her. "What?" "Every month for the past year." She opened her phone and showed me a list of bank transfers. Each one had the same description. "For Dad's medicine." The payments were not $20. They were $200, month after month. I scrolled through the transactions, unable to understand what I was seeing. "Matthew never gave me any of this." "I know." Her voice cracked. "I found out yesterday." I looked toward the window. The maple tree Linda planted swayed gently in the afternoon wind. "Then why did he tell me you couldn't afford $20? Emily pulled out a chair but didn't sit. "Because the money wasn't going to your medicine." "Where was it going?" She looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Fear. The house. I thought of the photograph. The ribbon. The key. The $60,000 sign. "So he used the money to buy you a house?" "No." Her answer came so quickly that I looked up. That house isn't mine. But you were standing in front of it. Matthew told me it was a surprise for us. He said we were going to rent it out. She wiped her face. This morning I found the ownership papers. My heart began beating faster. Whose name is on them? She hesitated. Then she reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded document. The moment she placed it on the table, I recognized the address. It wasn't just any house. It stood 2 streets away from mine. And the buyer's name wasn't Emily's. It was Matthew's, but beneath his name was another line. Authorized funding source, Raymond Ellis Medical Reserve Account. I stared at those words. Years earlier, Linda and I had created that account to cover my future medical expenses. Only 2 people had access, me and my son. Emily began crying. He didn't just refuse to buy your insulin, she whispered. He used the money meant to keep you alive to buy that house. I could barely breathe. Then she said something even worse. Mr. Ellis, I don't think he bought it as an investment. I looked at her. Then why did he buy it? Emily slowly turned toward the living room window. From where she stood, she could see the maple tree, the porch, and the entire front of my property. Because he believes once you're gone, she said, he can buy this house too. I couldn't take my eyes off the document. Authorized funding source, Raymond Ellis Medical Reserve Account. Linda and I had opened that account 20 years earlier. Every birthday check, every tax refund, every little bit we could spare after paying bills. We put it there for one reason, so I would never have to choose between food and medicine when I grew old. Now I understood why the balance had been shrinking faster than it should have. My own son hadn't been helping me. He had been helping himself. Emily wiped away her tears. I didn't know, Mr. Ellis. I swear I didn't know. I believe you. I thought Matthew was managing your finances because you trusted him. I did trust him. Those 4 words were harder to say than I expected. She slowly sat across from me. When I confronted him this morning, he admitted he'd been moving money from your medical account. I closed my eyes. What exactly did he say? Emily hesitated. He said, she whispered, Dad doesn't need all that money. He's old. Half the time he forgets to take his medicine anyway. For the first time in years, I felt something inside me break. Not anger, not hatred, just disappointment so deep it left no room for either. Emily reached into her handbag again. This isn't everything. She handed me another envelope. Inside were photocopies of bank statements. Transfer after transfer, small amounts at first, then larger ones. $500, $1,000, $3,000. Nearly $40,000 had disappeared over the previous 18 months. Every withdrawal carried the same digital authorization. Matthew Ellis. I copied everything before I left, Emily said. He doesn't know I have these. I carefully placed the papers beside Linda's old photograph. Then I looked at Emily. What are you going to do? She gave a sad smile. I'm leaving him. The room fell silent. Outside, the afternoon breeze carried leaves across the front porch. Finally, I stood and walked toward the maple tree Linda had planted. I rested my hand against its rough bark. For years, I'd believed losing my wife had been the greatest heartbreak of my life. I was wrong. Nothing compares to watching your own child become someone you no longer recognize. Behind me, Emily quietly spoke. I've already contacted the bank. I turned. And? They froze the remaining money this morning. My heart skipped. She continued. And tomorrow, the bank's fraud investigator wants to meet with both of us. For the first time since Matthew told me he couldn't afford $20 for my insulin, I realized the truth wasn't just coming. It was already knocking on his front door.